It's April 1945. The world that once quivered beneath the might of Hitler's armies was now crumbling around him. The man who had once commanded Europe's grand stages, promising a 1,000-year Reich, now huddled underground in a damp concrete bunker beneath the shattered remains of Berlin. For years, he had lived in the illusion of destiny, dismissing every defeat and every setback as fleeting. The Führer's will was proclaimed unbreakable by his ministers, yet the reality told a different story. Above him, Berlin burned. The Red Army was mere miles away, its artillery reverberating through the city. Within the Führer bunker, there was no daylight, only the dim flicker of failing lamps, curling smoke from cigarettes, and the pervasive stench of fear. Maps adorned the walls, smeared with red arrows marking phantom counterattacks that would never materialize. Hitler refused to flee. His generals pleaded for him to escape to the Alps to regroup, but he responded with disbelief and laughter. Surrender? Never. I will not run like a coward. To him, retreat was a disgrace, and death was preferable to humiliation. Yet behind those icy blue eyes, a subtle change had begun. For the first time, Adolf Hitler began to grasp that his world, his empire, his absolute control, his myth was crumbling. The first fissure appeared when Goering, his once devoted deputy, sent a message proposing he assume command if Berlin became isolated. Practicality for any sane leader, treachery in Hitler's mind, rage consumed him. He branded Goering a traitor and demanded his arrest. But deep inside he understood the implications. Even his closest aides no longer believed in victory. Every major city in Germany lay in ruins. The Western Allies pressed in from one front, the Soviets from another. The supposedly invincible Reich was encircled, starving, fractured. Still, Hitler clung to fantasy. He pinned hope on the so-called Steiner counterattack, a last stand envisioned by General Felix Steiner, which he believed could annihilate the Soviets and rescue Berlin. But Steiner never received reinforcements, never advanced. The order was an impossible dream. When informed of Steiner's inaction, Hitler snapped. Eyewitnesses described him trembling violently, pounding his fists against tables, screaming that the war was lost and everyone had betrayed him. It was the notorious bunker meltdown, a moment seared into the memory of even his most loyal officers. The illusion had shattered completely. For the first time, Hitler voiced words his men thought impossible. The war is lost. He dismissed everyone from the room. When they returned, his voice had dulled, his face pale, drained, almost ghost-like. Gone were discussions of victory, destiny, or glory. He spoke only of death. He vowed to remain in Berlin and take his own life when the time came. The man who had ruled Europe with a single command now cowered in the shadows, staring at the floor. Even the bunker's air felt heavier, as though history itself pressed down upon them. Outside, the sounds of combat drew nearer. Tanks rumbled, artillery shook the streets. The Soviets had reached the city center. Berlin was engulfed in fire, civilians fleeing through rubble. SS officers burned documents, and soldiers too young to shave were hurled into defending streets that no longer existed. Hitler's empire of fear, lies, and iron was unraveling faster than he could process. He wasn't merely losing a war. He was losing himself. The godlike image he had cultivated in his mind was crumbling. Propaganda had long proclaimed him chosen by fate. Yet as each explosion rattled the walls, even he questioned whether fate had forsaken him. On his desk, a portrait of Friedrich the Great, the Prussian monarch who had transformed near defeat into victory, watched silently. Hitler stared at it frequently, awaiting a miracle that never came. By mid-April, news reached him that his closest allies were gone. Himmler was secretly negotiating with the Allies. Goebbels was emotionally unraveling, and his once mighty generals were dead, captured, or fleeing. The man who had commanded millions now oversaw a mere handful of terrified staff and secretaries, trapped underground in a tomb of his own making. Then came the final blow, reports that Soviet forces were just blocks from the Reich Chancellery. The roar of artillery shook the night. The end was no rumor anymore. It was footsteps above. He realized that there would be no escape, no victory, no redemption, only the final act. The true moment of reckoning did not arrive amid strategy meetings or battles. It came in silence. Alone in his private quarters, he closed the door, gazed into a mirror, and saw not the Führer, not the conqueror of Europe, but an old, broken man awaiting death. The reflection stared back, pale skin, trembling hands, eyes emptied of fury, replaced by a haunting void. Adolf Hitler, once the architect of a new world order, now resembled a ghost of his own making. He understood the end was near, yet he sought to orchestrate it, to command even his final moments as he had once commanded nations. Victory denied, he chose control over his death. Orders were given to burn every document that could disgrace him, and to ensure his body was destroyed after death. He feared the fate of Mussolini, displayed publicly in humiliation. Vanity ruled his final hours more than humanity. Outside, the Red Army advanced street by street. Berlin, once majestic, had become a wasteland. Buildings gutted, smoke blackened the sky. The echoes of tanks and flamethrowers resounded through the ruins. Hitler could hear it all. Each blast mirrored the heartbeat of his dying empire. Within the bunker, food was nearly exhausted. Water pressure failed, electricity faltered. Secretaries wept quietly. Some swallowed cyanide rather than face capture. Even his dog, Blondie, became part of his delusion. He tested poison on her to confirm its potency. This was the man he had become, a ruler so engulfed by fear that death was more trusted than loyalty. By April 29th, the radio delivered his final humiliation. Mussolini, his closest ally and mirror in Italy, had been captured, executed, and desecrated by his own people. Hitler lingered over the report in silence. Then, in a voice barely audible, he whispered, "I will not suffer Mussolini's fate." That moment marked his acceptance of death, not as surrender, but as the ultimate exercise of control. He would determine the Third Reich's conclusion. That night he married Eva Braun, not from love, but as a ritual, a final semblance of normalcy before collapse. They toasted with cheap champagne as artillery shook the bunker. Witnesses described him as calm, polite, distant, almost gentle, as though the storm within him had quieted. Outside that dimly lit room, everything was over. The Red Army had entered the government district. Gunfire echoed overhead. Soldiers surrendered or perished in the streets. No army remained to save him. No fortress could defend him. Only a bunker beneath a city that no longer existed. When aides entered, they found him slumped on a couch, pistol in hand. Eva Braun beside him, the faint scent of cyanide in the air. The man who had demanded millions die for him could not face defeat himself. His guards carried their bodies to the garden and incinerated them under Berlin's grey sky, exactly as he had ordered. Above, Soviet shells continued to strike. The empire that had stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga ended in a few feet of ash. When Soviet forces discovered the bunker days later, they found a scene frozen in decay. Maps scattered, half-eaten food, desperate notes scrawled on walls. Smoke, sweat, and fear permeated every corner. The air in Hitler's final room was heavy, as if history itself refused to move forward. His guards surrendered soon after. Berlin fell entirely on May 2nd. Within a week, Nazi Germany, the so-called Thousand-Year Reich, was erased. It had lasted barely 12 years, but the story did not end there. In the following months, rumors spread that Hitler had escaped, alive somewhere in South America. For many Germans, fantasy was easier to believe than the bitter truth. The truth was that their Führer had abandoned them long before reality itself was abandoned. The real moment Hitler lost the war did not occur in the bunker. It was years earlier, the moment he considered himself infallible, convinced destiny could never betray him. The bunker was merely where that delusion finally perished. As Berlin burned, millions of lives were shattered across Europe. Families torn apart, cities obliterated, generations scarred. And for what? For the delusion of a man who imagined himself greater than reality. Ultimately, History remembers Hitler not for his empire or speeches, but for the silence that followed. The silence of a ruined city, the silence of a bunker deep underground, and the silence of a man who finally grasped that the world he had built on hatred could not survive him. The Third Reich did not end with a heroic battle or grand stand. It ended with a single gunshot echoing through darkness, marking the fall of a dictator who believed he could rewrite fate. And in that instant the world exhaled. The nightmare was finally over.